Did you know that Luka Doncic is the first rookie in over 50 years to average 20 points, 7 rebounds, and 5 assists per game? Oscar Robertson last did it back in 1961. You may have also heard that Giannis Antetokounmpo is the first player to average 27, 12, and 5 since Kareem back in 1976. There are a bunch of players putting up numbers we haven't seen in years, and it's not because there was something in the water 50 years ago that players suddenly rediscovered today. Instead, this boom in counting stats is a direct byproduct of changes in the rules, and thus strategy, and those changes have influenced pace, efficiency, and volume. That is, the sheer number of points and rebounds accrued in the game. But before we get to that, let's first look at how the rules have evolved over the years. One of the biggest changes ever has no entry in the record books, and that's the way dribbling and traveling have been officiated over time. Here's what Bob Cousy, the best dribbler of the 1950s, looked like: palm strictly facing down, no supination or turning of the wrist. And this wasn't because players didn't practice dribbling. They simply weren't allowed to control the ball in midair by turning their wrists. There's limited film, but Elgin Baylor in the early 1960s was one of the first players to cross over like this, stretching the boundaries of legally palming the ball, turning it slightly in midair during his crossover. By the late 60s and early 70s, average ball handlers were rotating their wrists slightly and increasing contact time with the basketball. By the 1980s, players were subtly expanding the boundaries of legality. Isaiah Thomas was one of the first guards to severely flex his wrist to control the rock, well in the air right there, and he even rotated the ball mid-dribble. This was once illegal. By the mid-1990s, advanced handlers were nearly pausing their dribble and turning their wrist completely as they guided the ball back to the floor. This mid-dribble suspension from palming or cupping the basketball allows for superior change of direction and penetration that wasn't possible in prior decades. Today, players can completely turn their wrist over while pausing and then restarting their dribble. This is almost never a violation and allows for hesitation and upfakes, as well as superior ball control. And then there's traveling. Here's a play from the 1970 season called a travel. I mean, really, that's one step at most, and no one even bats an eyelash that it was called a walk. Here's the earliest Euro step I've been able to find, and it was swiftly whistled a violation. It's been permitted for at least 15 years, but back then, large strides and hops weren't allowed. Flamboyant refereeing was, though. Scottie Pippen was the first prominent star to stretch what we now know as the gather step. Broadcasters immediately called for a blatant walk here, but proponents of the gather might argue he collected right now and thus only took 2 steps. By the 2000s, this became more normal, and 3-step plays are now fairly common. Other formal rule changes have made scoring easier too, such as freedom of movement rules that prohibited off-ball contact like this, and outlawed hand-checking above the free throw line. And, of course, the modern offense's biggest edge is the three-point shot, which has stretched defenses thin, unclogged driving lanes, and, counts for more points. Now, if you have thoughts on all these rule changes, or you just love talking hoops, check out the Hardwood Amino app. They've been kind enough to sponsor today's video, and they have over 100,000 hardcore fans on the app talking all things NBA. As you can see, it's very visually engaging. They always have topic posts featured, the latest Twitter happenings, and even live polls. I'll say Jokic, but that needs a video. My favorite section is the app's historical team wikis. These are dives into teams from the past. They're really cool. Download it from the App Store if you don't already have it. Check it out. There are topics on everything like, say, the best stats ever. And most people think it's someone from the 1960s. There you go. But fail to account for changes in rules and strategy that make scoring easier or harder. For one thing, there were way more possessions to rack up numbers in the past, with pace peaking at a ludicrous 130 possessions per game back in 1962 before downshifting into the more under-control pace that's closer to today's game. Illegal defense rules were put in right here, and this led to the so-called isolation era, gradually slowing the game down to seek out one-on-one advantages. This meant that a major counting stat, like rebounds, dropped as the game slowed down because there were simply fewer shots to rebound. Over 70 per game at its apex compared to just over 40 at its low point. Here's what offensive efficiency looks like over the years. The expansion of all those rules we looked at earlier made it easier to pressure defenses as an individual, replacing harmless passing that led to low percentage jumpers with dangerous penetration and kickouts. Pace played a role too. Teams were hunting for more efficient shots into the late 80s before the physical grind of iso ball left teams stuck in the mud in the so-called dead ball era. We can see this most clearly in how low-scoring games were as pace and efficiency cratered during the dead ball era. Teams averaged just 95 points per game during this period, as it was simply harder to generate points then, even for the stars. The byproduct of all these changes shows up in something like frequency of triple-doubles. There were triple-doubles in about 8% of all games at one point, back when rebounds were at their apex. With the recent boom in scoring efficiency and pace, triple-doubles are again on the rise. We technically don't even have complete records before 1983, so if anything, this graphic slightly undersells the difference between the 1960s and everything after. Triple-doubles correlate so strongly with these league averages that if we combine league-wide points, rebounds, and defensive rebounding rate, we can accurately predict the rise and fall of triple-doubles across the league. That's the blue line here. There are a few areas where it's slightly different, but for the most part, a basic combination of these stats predicts how many triple-doubles we'll see in a year. Pace and efficiency impact high-scoring games as well. This year, about 2/3 of games have had a 30-point individual score. At the low point of the dead ball era in 1999, less than a quarter of games featured a 30-point score. So, the evolution in rules and strategy has led to major changes in counting stats and in player efficiency. Comparing shooting in 1962 to shooting today is apples to oranges. What was once superhuman is now merely league average. In other words, in order to understand a player's impact in a given season, we need to look at their stats relative to the norms of that season. One way to do this is essentially to adjust for inflation, the way economists do, where it's common to express the cost of something from 1985 in 2019 dollars. If we did that, what would old stats look like in 2019 values, and would the players of today still be in rarefied statistical air? Before we answer this, a disclaimer: remember, the common practice of summarizing players with their points, rebounds, assists, slash line is a fairly crude overview of how good the player actually was. It leaves out scoring efficiency and defense entirely, and even raw rebounding numbers are less informative than, say, rebounding percentages, the share of available rebounds a player grabs. Well, assists in a vacuum aren't much better either, which is why I prefer something like passer rating or box creation. With that said, we can normalize each player's points, rebounds, and assists based on how easy they were to come by in a given season. For instance, in 1962, teams were about 80% as efficient as they are today, so scoring 8 points then is the equivalent of 10 points today. We might also want to account for pace, given how some stars in the past used to play 120 possessions in a game, and a typical star today plays about 75. So let's use per 75 possessions as an even playing field. We can also look at scoring efficiency relative to league average to get a more apples-to-apples comparison. If we make these adjustments, Luka Doncic would be only the 7th rookie in our new, adjusted 25-5 club, and the first since 2010 to hit those numbers. His rebounding stands out after Oscar Robertson is adjusted down to 2019 figures, And Luka is the first rookie since Alvin Adams in 1976 to hit 20 points, 8 rebounds, and 6 assists per 75 possessions using this adjustment. And what about Giannis? He's actually the only player with adjusted per 75 averages over 28 points, 13 rebounds, and 6 assists ever. His season still stands out even when we relax these filters. He's only the third player to hit 25, 12, and 5 with this kind of adjustment, joining Kevin Garnett in 2004 and Boogie Cousins in 2017. And finally, revisiting the topic of an earlier video on this channel, James Harden still holds the highest league-adjusted scoring rate ever at 36 points per 75 possessions, eclipsing Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant at 35.4 per 75. Of note, Wilt's famous 1962 season adjusts to 33.9 points per 75 today, and Stephen Curry's 2016 season is probably the most bonkers scoring year ever, where he led the league in volume and efficiency. Now, you might be thinking, per possession numbers are fine and dandy when it comes to understanding how frequently someone scores. But what about differences in minutes played and total game production? After all, Chamberlain logged 48 minutes a game back in 1962, while many stars today don't even play 35. So, to convert per game numbers to 2019 values, we can adjust a player's minutes based on how many minutes the other top players in the season played. The top 16 players today average 35.7 minutes per game, whereas the top players in 1962 average 41.5 minutes per game. That'd be a 14% reduction in minutes, meaning that Wilt Chamberlain's 1962 minutes of 48.5 convert to 41.6 today. We can then take his per 75 adjusted stats, assume he plays at today's league average pace of 100 possessions a game, and convert his 1962 stat line into 2019 values: 39 points, 13 rebounds, and 2 assists per night. That's still the best league-adjusted per-game scoring output ever, topping his 1963 season, Harden, MJ, and Kobe. The 2 assists per game are a problem, but that's a topic for a later video. Even these aren't perfect adjustments because there are no perfect adjustments to compare stats across seasons. The best we can do is to try to understand the impact a player had in his own time, playing under the rules of that time, and then account for additional context, like the quality of their teammates or coaches. But when we compare great players to the past, the very least we can do is adjust for inflation. All of the player art for this video was created by Crumpled Jumper. A big thanks to him. I highly recommend following his work at 538 Nylon Calculus and on Twitter. If you're interested in more about the historical evolution of strategy and rules, I created a visual history of spacing that I'll link to in the description down below. It details how teams have slowly but strategically spread the floor over the years. If you're interested in more of these historical adjustments, I do share them with my patrons. You can become one over at patreon.com/thinkingbasketball. Thanks again to Hardwood Amino for sponsoring this video. I know many of you already post there, and I hope many more will sign up. And as always, I hope you're having a great day.